Hello, young soul. Welcome to the Daily Horror Channel. If you are afraid of real and scary reports, this channel is not for you. I suggest you leave this video, but if you are not afraid of listening to these horrifying reports, I suggest you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Deep within a dense ancient forest called Blackwood, where sunlight barely penetrates the canopy of ancient trees, lie secrets that defy human comprehension. Located on the outskirts of the sleepy town of Ravenswood, Blackwood Forest is known for being a place where people mysteriously disappear. Some say that the forest is alive, with a consciousness of its own, and an insatiable desire to capture lost souls. This is the setting for our story, where a lonely botanist finds herself at the center of a nightmare that transcends time and reality. My name is Alice. I am 35 years old, and I have dedicated my life to the study of rare and exotic plants. Ever since I was a child, I have always been fascinated by nature and its mystical power. I grew up hearing stories about Blackwood Forest from the residents of Ravenswood, but I never really believed in the legends of vengeful spirits and dark creatures. To me, Blackwood was simply an untouched place rich in biodiversity, waiting to be explored. So when an opportunity arose to study a rare plant that supposedly flourished only in the darkness of that forest, I didn't hesitate to accept. I arrived in Ravenswood on a cloudy autumn day. The little town seemed stuck in time with its old houses and cobblestone streets. The locals eyed me with curiosity and suspicion, whispering to each other. I checked into a simple inn, where the owner, an elderly woman named Margaret, warned me about the dangers of the forest. "Are you really going to go into Blackwood?" Margaret asked, her blue eyes fixed on mine. "People disappear there, you know. The forest has a way of making people lose their way." I smiled, trying to look brave. "I'm a botanist, Margaret. I've been in forests far more dangerous than this. I know how to take care of myself." Margaret sighed, resigned. "Well, be careful, Alice. And if you hear whispers or see shadows moving, run for the exit and don't look back." The next morning, with my research gear on my back, I set off for Blackwood Forest. The walk to the forest entrance was uneventful, but once I crossed the tree line, the atmosphere changed dramatically. The air became colder and damper, and the silence was unsettling. Not even the birds sang here. As I got deeper into the forest, the feeling of being watched grew stronger and stronger. I glanced over my shoulder constantly, but never saw anything beyond the ancient trees and thick undergrowth. Every now and then, I felt a chilly breeze and heard distant, almost indistinguishable whispers. It must be the wind, I told myself, trying to shake off my growing fear. I spent the day exploring and collecting plant samples. The forest was truly rich in biodiversity, and I encountered several species I had never seen before. I was so absorbed in my work that I didn't realize how late it was getting. As the sun began to set, I decided it was time to head back. It was then that I realized I was lost. The trail I had been following had disappeared, and the trees around me all looked the same. The feeling of oppression grew, and my heart began to beat faster. I tried to remain calm, but the whispers around me grew louder and clearer. "Help us. Don't leave. Stay with us." The whispers were disturbing, and I knew something was very wrong. I began to walk quickly, trying to find the way out, but it seemed as if the forest was closing in on me. Closing in on me. Shadows danced at the edges of my vision, and every time I looked directly at them, they disappeared. "Calm down, Alice. You're a scientist. There's nothing supernatural here," I told myself, though my words sounded hollow. I kept walking until total darkness fell over the forest. My flashlights could barely illuminate the path ahead, and the cold became unbearable. Suddenly, I heard a sound that made me stop. Footsteps. "Is anyone there?" I called, my voice shaking. There was no answer, but the footsteps continued, now getting closer. My heart raced and a sense of panic washed over me. I decided to run, but the footsteps echoed around me, seeming to come from every direction. Suddenly, I tripped over something and fell to the ground. When I got up, I saw that I had stumbled upon an old moss-covered tombstone. I looked around and realized that I was in an old cemetery, hidden deep in the woods. The tombstones were old and barely legible, but I could make out a few names and dates. All of the burials dated back over a century. As I explored the cemetery, I heard a soft, sad voice behind me. "You shouldn't be here." I turned quickly and saw a young woman with long, disheveled hair, dressed in a dirty white dress. Her eyes were empty and sad, and her skin was as pale as the moon. "Who are you?" I asked, trying to hide my fear. "My name is Clara," she replied, her voice a whisper. "I was sacrificed here, along with my family a long time ago. We've been stuck in this forest ever since, and now you are too." I felt an icy cold pass through my body. "What do you want from me?" "Help us find peace," said Clara, her eyes full of despair. "Break the curse that binds us here." Before I could respond, Clara disappeared and the whispers around me increased. The shadows were approaching, and I knew I needed to act quickly. I remembered the stories Margaret told about the forest and its ancient pagan rituals. Maybe there was a way to free these lost souls. I followed the whispers that guided me through the cemetery until I found an ancient stone altar covered in strange symbols. I felt an oppressive presence around me. As if I was being watched by countless entities, I decided to perform an improvised ritual, using my knowledge of botany and some plants I had collected. As he prepared the ritual, the whispers became screams of agony and despair. The shadows around me twisted and drew closer, and I felt a biting cold pierce my soul. With shaking hands, I lit some candles and began to recite words of purification and liberation. May these souls find the peace that has been denied them. May the curse be broken and the forest free. Suddenly, an intense light enveloped the altar, and the shadows retreated, screaming in agony. Clara appeared again, now smiling serenely. "Thank you, Alice. You freed us." Before I could respond, Clara and the shadows disappeared, and silence took over the forest. The feeling of oppression dissipated, and I felt an indescribable peace. I looked around and saw that the cemetery was lit by the soft light of the moon, and the trees seemed less threatening. I found my way back to the trail, and eventually made my way out of the woods. When I arrived at the inn, Margaret greeted me with a relieved smile. "You did it, Alice. The forest is at peace again." Despite the relief, I knew that my experience at Blackwood would mark me forever. Clara's visions and the whispers of lost souls would never completely leave me. But I was determined to continue my research and help other souls in need of deliverance. As I got ready for bed, I heard one last whisper in the wind. "We'll meet again, Alice." And I knew that although we had achieved a victory, the true terror would never completely disappear. We were ready to face whatever came, knowing that the battle against the forces of darkness was far from over. As I tried to recover from the terrifying experience in Blackwood Forest, I felt something was wrong. Even though I had freed the lost souls and felt momentary peace, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was still chasing me. The shadows on the inn walls seemed longer and darker than usual, and the whispers in the wind continued to haunt me. The next morning, I decided to look deeper into Blackwood's story. Margaret, seeing my determination, told me about an old manuscript kept in the city library that might hold answers. "Careful, Alice," she warned. "Many tried to uncover the secrets of the forest and were never seen again." I went to the library, an old dusty building that looked like it came from another century. The shelves were high and filled with old, forgotten books. I found the manuscript in a remote section, covered in dust and cobwebs. When I opened the book, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The pages were filled with strange symbols and accounts of macabre rituals performed in the forest. One name stood out again and again: the Shadow Guardian. As I read, I discovered that the Shadow Guardian was an ancient entity, an evil spirit that dominated the forest and fed on the souls of its victims. The sacrifices that Clara and her family suffered were just part of an endless cycle of pain and suffering. As night fell, The library seemed to close in around me, and the air became heavy and oppressive. I decided to take the manuscript with me and leave before it got darker. On the way back to the inn, I felt a presence following me, but when I looked over my shoulder, I saw nothing but the shadows of the trees swaying in the wind. Back in the relative safety of the inn, I continued to read the manuscript, looking for a way to defeat the Shadow Guardian once and for all. There was a passage that spoke of a final ritual, a banishing spell that could destroy the entity and free the creatures, Blackwood souls forever. But the ritual required a final sacrifice, something that filled me with fear and hesitation. Margaret walked into the room and saw the look on my face. "You found something, didn't you?" she asked, worried. "Yes," I replied, showing him the manuscript. "But to end this once and for all, I need to perform a ritual that requires a final sacrifice." Margaret was silent for a moment before speaking. "Alice, I know your family history. Her grandmother, Clara, was one of those sacrificed. You have a bond with the forest that none of us can understand. Perhaps this is the necessary sacrifice." I was shocked to hear that. Clara was my grandmother. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, and I felt a new determination grow within me. If this is true, I need to do whatever is necessary to free my family and other souls. The following night, I returned to the forest, taking the manuscript and the items needed for the ritual. The walk to the old altar was filled with a feeling of déjà vu, as if I was reliving Clara's memories. The shadows closed around me, and the whispers became screams of despair. I arrived at the altar and started preparing the ritual. The candles lit with a ghostly glow and the air turned chilly. I recited the ancient words, feeling an invisible force grow around me. The shadows approached, and the Shadow Guardian appeared, his distorted and evil figure radiating pure hatred. "Do you think you can defeat me?" he roared, his voice echoing through the forest. With my heart beating fast, I continued the ritual, focusing all my energy on the task. The candlelight shone brightly, and I felt Clara's presence beside me, giving me strength. "I'm not alone," I declared, facing the Guardian. "I have the power of all the souls you have imprisoned." The Guardian screamed in rage and pain as the light consumed him. The shadows around him dissipated, and I felt the forest shake with the force of the banishment. In the final moment, an explosion of light filled the altar, and the Guardian disappeared, leaving only silence and peace. I fell to my knees, exhausted but relieved. The souls were finally free, and Blackwood's curse had been broken. When I returned to the city, Margaret welcomed me with tears in her eyes. "You did it, Alice. You freed the forest and your family." As we hugged, I heard one last whisper in the wind, but this time it was a whisper of gratitude and peace. "Thank you, Alice. You freed us." But I knew that despite this victory, true terror would never completely disappear. There were other mysteries and evil forces in the world waiting to be discovered, and I was ready to face them, knowing that the battle against darkness was far from over. As I tried to recover from the terrifying experience in Blackwood Forest, I felt something was wrong. Even though I had freed the lost souls and felt momentary peace, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was still chasing me. The shadows on the inn walls seemed longer and darker than usual, and the whispers in the wind continued to haunt me. The next morning, I decided to look deeper into Blackwood's story. Margaret, seeing my determination, told me about an old manuscript kept in the city library that might hold answers. "Careful, Alice," she warned. "Many tried to uncover the secrets of the forest and were never seen again." I went to the library, an old, dusty building that looked like it came from another century. The shelves were high and filled with old, forgotten books. I found the manuscript in a remote section, covered in dust and cobwebs. When I opened the book, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The pages were filled with strange symbols and accounts of macabre rituals performed in the forest. One name stood out again and again: the Shadow Guardian. As I read, I discovered that the Shadow Guardian was an ancient entity, an evil spirit that dominated the forest and fed on the souls of its victims. The sacrifices that Clara and her family suffered were just part of an endless cycle of pain and suffering. As night fell, the library seemed to close in around me, and the air became heavy and oppressive. I decided to take the manuscript with me and leave before it got darker. On the way back to the inn, I felt a presence following me. But when I looked over my shoulder, I saw nothing but the shadows of the trees swaying in the wind. Back in the relative safety of the inn, I continued to read the manuscript, looking for a way to defeat the Shadow Guardian once and for all. There was a passage that spoke of a final ritual, a banishing spell that could destroy the entity and free Blackwood's souls forever. But the ritual required a final sacrifice, something that filled me with fear and hesitation. Margaret walked into the room and saw the look on my face. "You found something, didn't you?" she asked, worried. "Yes," I replied, showing him the manuscript. "But to end this once and for all, I need to perform a ritual that requires a final sacrifice." Margaret was silent for a moment before speaking. "Alice, I know your family history. Her grandmother, Clara, was one of those sacrificed. You have a bond with the forest that none of us can understand. Perhaps this is the necessary sacrifice." I was shocked to hear that. Clara was my grandmother. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, and I felt a new determination grow within me. If this is true, I need to do whatever is necessary to free my family and other souls. The following night, I returned to the forest, taking the manuscript and the items needed for the ritual. The walk to the old altar was filled with a feeling of déjà vu, as if I was reliving Clara's memories. The shadows closed around me, and the whispers became screams of despair. I arrived at the altar and started preparing the ritual. The candles lit with a ghostly glow and the air turned chilly. I recited the ancient words, feeling an invisible force grow around me. The shadows approached and the Shadow Guardian appeared, his distorted and evil figure radiating pure hatred. "Do you think you can defeat me?" he roared, his voice echoing through the forest. With my heart beating fast, I continued the ritual, focusing all my energy on the task. The candlelight shone brightly and I felt Clara's presence beside me, giving me strength. "I'm not alone," I declared, facing the Guardian. "I have the power of all the souls you have imprisoned." The Guardian screamed in rage and pain as the light consumed him. The shadows around him dissipated, and I felt the forest shake with the force of the banishment. In the final moment, an explosion of light filled the altar, and the Guardian disappeared, leaving only silence and peace. I fell to my knees, exhausted but relieved. The souls were finally free, and Blackwood's curse had been broken. When I returned to the city, Margaret welcomed me with tears in her eyes. "You did it, Alice. You freed the forest and your family." As we hugged, I heard one last whisper in the wind, but this time it was a whisper of gratitude and peace. "Thank you, Alice. You freed us." But I knew that despite this victory, true terror would never completely disappear. There were other mysteries and evil forces in the world, waiting to be discovered, and I was ready to face them, knowing that the battle against darkness was far from over. As I tried to recover from the terrifying experience in Blackwood Forest, I felt something was wrong. Even though I had freed the lost souls and felt momentary peace, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was still chasing me. The shadows on the inn wall seemed longer and darker than usual, and the whispers in the wind continued to haunt me. The next morning, I decided to look deeper into Blackwood's story. Margaret, seeing my determination, told me about an old manuscript kept in the city library that might hold answers. "Careful, Alice," she warned. "Many tried to uncover the secrets of the forest and were never seen again." I went to the library, an old, dusty building that looked like it came from another century. The shelves were high and filled with old, forgotten books. I found the manuscript in a remote section, covered in dust and cobwebs. When I opened the book, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The pages were filled with strange symbols and accounts of macabre rituals performed in the forest. One name stood out again and again: the Shadow Guardian. As I read, I discovered that the Shadow Guardian was an ancient entity, an evil spirit that dominated the forest and fed on the souls of its victims. The sacrifices that Clara and her family suffered were just part of an endless cycle of pain and suffering. As night fell, the library seemed to close in around me, and the air became heavy and oppressive. I decided to take the manuscript with me and leave before it got darker. On the way back to the inn, I felt a presence following me. But when I looked over my shoulder, I saw nothing but the shadows of the trees swaying in the wind. Back in the relative safety of the inn, I continued to read the manuscript, looking for a way to defeat the Shadow Guardian once and for all. There was a passage that spoke of a final ritual, a banishing spell that could destroy the entity and free Blackwood's souls forever. But the ritual required a final sacrifice, something that filled me with fear and hesitation. Margaret walked into the room and saw the look on my face. "You found something, didn't you?" she asked, worried. "Yes," I replied, showing him the manuscript. "But to end this once and for all, I need to perform a ritual that requires a final sacrifice." Margaret was silent for a moment before speaking. "Alice, I know your family history. Her grandmother Clara was one of those sacrificed. You have a bond with the forest that none of us can understand. Perhaps this is the necessary sacrifice." I was shocked to hear that. Clara was my grandmother. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, and I felt a new determination grow within me. If this is true, I need to do whatever is necessary to free my family and other souls. The following night, I returned to the forest, taking the manuscript and the items needed for the ritual. The walk to the old altar was filled with a feeling of déjà vu, as if I was reliving Clara's memories. The shadows closed around me and the whispers became screams of despair. I arrived at the altar and started preparing the ritual. The candles lit with a ghostly glow, and the air turned chilly. I recited the ancient words, feeling an invisible force grow around me. The shadows approached, and the Shadow Guardian appeared, his distorted and evil figure radiating pure hatred. "Do you think you can defeat me?" he roared, his voice echoing through the forest. With my heart beating fast, I continued the ritual, focusing all my energy on the task. The candlelight shone brightly, and I felt Clara's presence beside me, giving me strength. "I'm not alone," I declared, facing the Guardian. "I have the power of all the souls you have imprisoned." The Guardian screamed in rage and pain as the light consumed him. The shadows around him dissipated, and I felt the forest shake with the force of the banishment. In the final moment, an explosion of light filled the altar, and the Guardian disappeared, leaving only silence and peace. I fell to my knees, exhausted but relieved. The souls were finally free, and Blackwood's curse had been broken. When I returned to the city, Margaret welcomed me with tears in her eyes. "You did it, Alice. You freed the forest and your family." As we hugged, I heard one last whisper in the wind. But this time it was a whisper of gratitude and peace. "Thank you, Alice. You freed us." But I knew that despite this victory, true terror would never completely disappear. There were other mysteries and evil forces in the world, waiting to be discovered. And I was ready to face them, knowing that the battle against darkness was far from over. In the vast darkness of Brazil's interior, where winding roads cut through desolate, deserted landscapes, there is an infamous route that truck drivers avoid. Known as the Road of the Disappeared, this desolate road is surrounded by sinister legends and unsolved mysteries. Stories of drivers disappearing without a trace, unexplained noises, and disturbing sights circulate among those who dare to travel there. For many, these stories are just superstitions. But for João, a veteran truck driver, The reality of these legends is about to become a terrifying experience. My name is João. I've been a truck driver for over 20 years, traveling the roads of this immense country. I've always preferred to travel at night when traffic is less intense and the tranquility of the road helps calm my thoughts. However, the road of the disappeared always gave me chills. The stories I heard at truck stops made me promise myself I would never take that route. But life has its ironies, and an urgent burden forced me to change my plans. It was a cold, moonless night when I entered the Estrada dos Desaparecidos. The silence was absolute, broken only by the constant sound of my truck's engine. The tall, shadowy trees along the road seemed to form a tunnel of darkness, blocking out any trace of light. I felt a growing sense of oppression, as if something invisible was watching me. I tried to dispel the fear with songs on the radio, but static soon replaced the melodies, leaving only the disturbing sound of hissing. As it progressed, strange little events began to happen. First, the truck's lights were flashing for no apparent reason. I checked the controls, but everything seemed normal. Then I started to hear whispers, like faint voices trying to communicate. I looked in the rearview mirror, but there was nothing but darkness. The feeling of being watched intensified, and I began to doubt my sanity. I decided to stop at a small rest area to get some air and try to calm my nerves. The night was cold, and a thick fog began to form around the truck. The silence was almost palpable, broken only by the distant sound of a cricket. As I walked around the truck, I noticed strange marks in the road dust, like footprints that mysteriously appeared and disappeared. I went back to the cab of the truck and tried to call my wife, Maria, but the cell phone signal was completely dead. Fear started to get the better of me, and I decided to keep driving in hopes of finding a busier area. As I drove, the fog became thicker, making it difficult to see. The truck's headlights barely illuminated the road ahead, and I felt an unsettling presence following me. Suddenly, the headlights of a car appeared in the rearview mirror, approaching quickly. My heart raced. Since I entered Estrada dos Desaparecidos, I had not seen another vehicle. The car seemed to be following my every move, keeping a constant distance. The tension was increasing by the second, and I began to imagine all the horrible stories I had heard about this road. I tried to speed up, but the car behind me did the same. Suddenly he disappeared, as if he had never existed. The relief was momentary, as I soon heard a loud sound of metal clashing. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw that the truck was intact. However, when I looked at the road again, I saw a pale, indistinct figure standing on the side of the road, watching me with empty eyes. My blood ran cold. The figure seemed to call to me, but I couldn't make out its words. I continued driving, trying to ignore the presence, but the image of that figure wouldn't leave my mind. It was like it was burned into my retina, a constant reminder that something was terribly wrong. As the night progressed, the disturbing events increased. The radio began to play a distorted, ominous melody, and the shadows inside the truck's cabin seemed to take on a life of their own. The voices in the whispers became clearer, speaking my name and begging for help. The feeling of cold and oppression was constant, and I felt like my sanity was slipping away. In a moment of desperation, I decided to stop at an old cabin that I saw on the side of the road. The structure looked abandoned for years, but any shelter seemed better than continuing to drive in those conditions. I entered the cabin, lighting the way with my flashlight. The interior was dusty and decaying, with broken furniture and windows covered in cobwebs. I sat in an old chair trying to catch my breath and calm my mind. It was then that I heard footsteps upstairs. I stood up quickly, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The steps were slow and heavy, as if someone was dragging their feet. I climbed the stairs cautiously, each step creaking under my weight. When I reached the top, I saw a half-open door at the end of the corridor. The light from my flashlight revealed a figure with its back to me standing in the center of the room. "Who's there?" My voice was weak, full of fear. The figure did not respond. I took a few more steps and the figure began to slowly turn around. When I finally saw his face, my heart almost stopped. It was the same pale figure I had seen on the road. His empty eyes stared at me, with an expression of pain and despair. "Please help me," the figure whispered, his voice a distant, anguished echo. Before I could respond, the figure disappeared, leaving the room cold and empty. I felt a cold hand touch my shoulder and I quickly turned around, but there was no one there. The feeling of dread was overwhelming and I knew I needed to get out of there as quickly as possible. I ran down the stairs and back to the truck. When I entered the cabin, I noticed something was different. The environment was even colder, and a thick fog was forming inside the truck. The voices and the whispers were louder, almost deafening. I felt a presence beside me and saw the pale figure sitting in the passenger seat, watching me with empty eyes. "You can't escape," the figure whispered, his voice full of despair. I accelerated the truck, trying to leave the cabin and that figure behind, but the feeling of oppression continued, and the voices didn't stop. I felt like I was losing my sanity, and the road in front of me seemed to stretch endlessly with no end in sight. It was then that I saw lights in the distance. A truck stop. My hope was renewed, and I drove toward the lights. When I arrived, I parked the truck and entered the diner. The atmosphere was warm and welcoming, a big difference from the cold and oppressive road. I sat at a table and ordered a coffee, trying to calm my nerves. While I waited, I talked to other truck drivers, telling them about my experience. They exchanged worried looks and confirmed that many had experienced similar situations on the Estrada dos Desaparecidos. One of the truck drivers, an elderly man named Seu Jorge, said that the road had been the scene of countless accidents and mysterious disappearances over the years. He mentioned that a truck driver had tragically died there decades ago, and that his spirit roamed the road, haunting those who dared to cross it. "Some say he is trapped between this world and the next, seeking redemption," said Seu Jorge, his voice full of gravity. Others believe he became something darker, feeding on the fear of the living. After hearing these stories, I decided I could no longer continue on that road. I needed to find an alternative path, even if it meant a significant detour. I thanked everyone for the stories and advice and returned to my truck, determined to get off that damned route. As I walked away from the truck stop, the feeling of overwhelm began to ease. The road seemed clearer, and the whispering voices finally fell silent. Yet the pale figure remained in my mind, its expression of pain and despair etched into my memory. The events of that night left a deep impression on me, and I never went down the Estrada dos Desaparecidos again. Whenever I hear truck drivers telling stories about that road, I get chills and remember the pale figure and voices that haunted me. I know there is something more on that road, something that science and logic cannot explain, something that is beyond our understanding and that continues to haunt those who dare cross its path. A few days later, when I was back to my normal routine, I started noticing strange things around the house. Objects that I knew I had left in one place appeared in another. Inaudible whispers echoed through the halls at night, and the feeling of being watched returned with frightening force. It was as if the presence I encountered on the road had followed me there. One night, while watching television with Maria, the sound distorted and the screen became static. A distorted melody began to play, and the lights in the room flickered. Maria looked at me, confused and scared. "John, what's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling. Before I could respond, the pale figure appeared in the window's reflection, its empty eyes staring back at us. I screamed and turned around, but the figure disappeared, leaving only a feeling of oppressive cold. Maria was in shock, and I knew I could no longer hide what had happened on Estrada dos Desaparecidos. I told her everything I experienced, every frightening detail. Maria tried to comfort me, but the worry was evident in her eyes. We decided we needed to do something to get rid of this presence. We consulted a local priest who came to our house to bless it and perform a prayer of protection. For a while, things seemed to be back to normal. The nights were peaceful and the feeling of oppression lessened. But one night I woke up to a loud screeching sound coming from downstairs. I walked down the stairs cautiously, the feeling of dread growing in my chest. When I reached the living room, I saw Maria standing in the middle of the room, her eyes wide with terror. The pale figure was standing beside her, his skeletal hand holding her shoulder. "You can't run away from me," the figure whispered, his voice an icy, disturbing echo. "I'm with you forever." Maria fell to the ground unconscious, and the figure disappeared. I ran to her, trying to wake her up, but she didn't respond. Despair took over me, and I called an ambulance. Paramedics quickly arrived and took Maria to hospital, where she was admitted in a state of shock. While she waited at the hospital, I felt her presence again. A pale figure appeared in the hallway, watching me with empty eyes and an expression of pure hatred. She began to slowly approach, and I knew I needed to face her. "What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the empty hallway. The figure stopped, his expression softening slightly. "My death was unjust and my spirit is trapped," she replied. "I need my story to be known so I can find peace." I then understood that the figure was the spirit of a truck driver who had tragically died on the Estrada dos Desaparecidos. I promised him that I would find out the truth about his death and that I would share his story. The figure watched me for a few more moments before disappearing, leaving a feeling of relief. I spent the next few weeks investigating the truck driver's story. I discovered he had been killed in an accident caused by negligent road maintenance. His death was covered up by the authorities, who did not want to admit guilt. I published the story in several newspapers and websites, seeking justice for the truck driver. After the story was published, the presence disappeared completely. Maria slowly recovered, and our life returned to normal. However, the experience left us scarred forever. The road of the missing remained a place of mystery and fear, but we knew we had helped a spirit find peace. I still get chills every time I go near that road, but I know I did the right thing. The story of the desert road killer will be remembered, and I hope other truck drivers will be more careful and respect the spirits that still roam there. Our fight against evil is far from over, but we are determined to face any challenge that comes, with courage and determination to never give up on the light, even on the darkest nights. As I drove away from the road of the missing, one last time I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the pale figure watching me, its empty eyes glowing in the darkness. The feeling that something was following me never completely went away, and I know that somewhere that truck driver's tormented soul still waits for redemption. My journey may be over, but the road and its dark mysteries continue, awaiting its next victim. In a small rural town where modernity has not yet erased the traces of the past, an ancient mystery lies buried. Deep in a forgotten backyard, an ancient well holds secrets that cry out for justice. This is the story of Julia, a young teacher who, when moving to this city in search of tranquility, ends up encountering something much darker than she could have imagined. My name is Julia. I've always been passionate about teaching, and that's why I accepted a job in a rural school, far from the hustle and bustle of the big city. I wanted a place where I could start over, breathe fresh air, and maybe find some peace. I rented an old but charming house on the outskirts of the city. The rent was cheap and the place was cozy. There was nothing to indicate this would be a nightmare scenario. The house was at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by green fields and some old trees. The yard was large and somewhat unkempt, but it had potential. It was on my second day there that I noticed the well, hidden beneath a layer of ivy and moss. It was a stone well, with a rusty bucket hanging from a rotting rope. There was something about him that immediately caught my attention, but at that moment I didn't think much of it. I decided I would take care of the yard for the few. The first nights were peaceful. The silence of the countryside was comforting, and the gentle wind blowing through the trees was almost a melody. However, some things started to bother me. Sometimes I thought I heard whispers at night. Initially, I thought it was my imagination or the sound of the wind through the trees, but the whispers seemed to form words, pleas for help. One night I woke up suddenly, feeling like something was wrong. I got up, and as I looked out the window, I saw a shadow moving near the well. The full moon illuminated the yard, and the well seemed darker and deeper than before. I walked down the stairs slowly, my heart beating fast. When I got close to the well, everything was silent. I looked inside, but I couldn't see anything but darkness. The following days were filled with a seemingly normal routine, but the whispers persisted. I was curious and decided to ask the residents about the well. Reactions were varied, but most people avoided talking about him. An old man at the bakery told me the well had a dark history, but he wouldn't go into details. Another resident, an elderly woman, made the sign of the cross when I mentioned the well and advised me to stay away from it. My curiosity was piqued. I decided to investigate further and went to the local library. There were few old records, but I found a newspaper article yellowed with age, dated 50 years ago. The title read, "Young man mysteriously disappears, last seen near the ancient well." The story told of a young girl named Helena who had disappeared without a trace. Her family never recovered from her disappearance, and the case was never solved. Something inside me said that the whispers and Helena's disappearance were connected. That night, I decided to try direct communication. I took a flashlight and went to the well. When I got there, the whispers became clearer. "Help me, please." The voice was weak but filled with despair. "Helena," I called, my voice shaking. "Are you there?" The silence that followed was deafening. Then a sound of heavy breathing echoed from the well, followed by a piercing scream that made my blood run cold. I backed away, terrified, and ran back home. That night was one of the longest of my life. I couldn't sleep, wondering what could be happening. The next day, I decided to go back to the library. This time I looked for more information about Helena's family. I discovered that her father, a man named Antonio, had become a recluse after his daughter's disappearance. They said he spent hours near the well, muttering words that no one could understand. Some people believed he was trying to communicate with his daughter's spirit. My next stop was Antonio's house. He was still alive, an elderly, frail man with eyes that seemed to carry the weight of the world. I told him about the whispers and asked if he knew anything. "Helena is trapped down there," he said, his voice low and hoarse. "She needs help, but the curse is too strong." Antonio told me that the well had been used in ancient rituals, long before the city was founded. It was a portal to another dimension where lost souls were trapped. Helena had fallen into the curse when she got too close to the well on a full moon night. "You have to free her," he said, holding my hand with surprising strength for someone his age. "Only then will she be able to rest in peace." That night, I decided to follow Antonio's instructions. I prepared myself with candles, an old ritual book he gave me, and all the courage I could muster. The sky was cloudy, and the air felt colder than usual. I went to the well and lit the candles around it. I began to recite the words from the book, my voice shaking but steady. While reciting the ritual, the wind picked up, blowing out some of the candles. The pit seemed darker and deeper than ever. The whispers grew louder, turning into harrowing screams. I felt a presence around me, as if something invisible was trying to stop the ritual. It was then that I saw a shadow move at the edge of the well. It was Helena, her figure translucent and her eyes full of despair. "Please help me," she begged, reaching out her hand toward me. I continued reciting the ritual, trying to ignore the fear that consumed me. Helena's shadow seemed to fight an invisible force that was pulling her back into the darkness. Finally, with an agonizing scream, the shadow was pulled into the pit, and absolute silence took over the place. I felt immediate relief but also deep sadness. He knew that Helena had been freed, but the price had been high. The well was sealed, but the terror of that night would stay with me forever. I returned home exhausted and shaken, but with the feeling that I had done the right thing. The next day, I went to Antonio's house to tell him what had happened. He greeted me with a sad smile and a look of gratitude. "You freed her," he said, tears streaming down his face. "Now she can rest in peace." Despite everything, I knew the story wasn't over. The well was still there, a portal to something beyond our understanding. As I write these words, I feel the presence of something dark and ancient. The curse of the dark forest may have been weakened, but it will never disappear completely. I know we will need to be ever vigilant, for terror could return at any moment, ready to envelop us in its cold, deadly embrace once again. Antonio was right. Helena was finally resting in peace. However, I still felt a weight, as if the well had left an indelible mark on my soul. The following nights were full of nightmares. I saw Helena being pulled into the darkness, her eyes filled with despair, and I heard the whispers that now seemed to echo in my own mind. I tried to convince myself that it was all over, but the fear persisted. One night, as I was trying to sleep, I heard the sound of whispering again. They came from the backyard. I got up, trying to ignore the growing dread, and went to the window. The well was there, as always, but there was something different. A faint light emanated from within, a spectral glow that shouldn't be there. I felt a chill go up my spine. Something was wrong. I walked down the stairs slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. I grabbed a flashlight and went out into the backyard. The wind was cold and sharp, making the surrounding trees sway as if they were alive. As I got closer to the well, the spectral light seemed more intense. I looked inside, and to my horror, saw a figure floating in the water. It wasn't Helena. She was someone else. Someone I didn't know but who seemed to be in agony. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice shaking. The figure didn't respond, but the whispers grew louder, filling the air around me. I took a step back, trying to shake off the fear. It was then that I heard a voice, faint and distant, but clearly audible. "The curse is not over yet," said the voice. "There are more souls trapped here, waiting for release." My heart raced. It couldn't be true. I had followed the ritual, freed Helena. How could there be more souls trapped in the well? I needed to find out the truth. I decided I would talk to Antonio again the next morning, hoping to get more answers. The night passed slowly and restlessly. The whispers continued, disturbing my sleep and filling my mind with doubts. When the sun finally came up, I quickly dressed and went to Antonio's house. He greeted me with a worried look, as if he knew what I was about to say. "Antonio, the well, there are more souls there. I saw another person in the water," he said, trying to control his panic. Antonio sighed, his face marked by sadness. "I was afraid this might happen," he said. "The curse is older and deeper than we imagine. Freeing Helena was just the beginning. We need to keep going, find out who these souls are and help them find peace." We decided to go back to the well together. Antonio brought with him more old books and a map that showed the area around the house, revealing ancient ritual sites that could be connected to the well. We spent the day studying the documents and planning our next move. When night fell again, we headed to the well, prepared to face whatever was waiting for us. We lit candles around us, creating a circle of protection, and began to recite the words from the ancient books. The air became heavy, and the feeling of oppression increased. The whispers turned into screams, and the spectral light within the pit shone brightly. Suddenly, the figure I had seen in the water began to emerge. He was a young man, with eyes full of fear and pain. "Help me," he whispered, his voice weak but desperate. "I've been trapped here for so long." We continued the ritual, trying to ignore the fear that enveloped us. The young man's figure seemed to be fighting an invisible force, just as Helena had done. But this time, the resistance was greater. The pit seemed to be resisting as if it didn't want to let go of its prey. Suddenly, a strong wind blew, blowing out the candles and plunging us into darkness. The only light came from the well, now brighter than ever. I felt a cold hand grab my arm, and I turned to see the young man's figure, now outside the well, but still trapped by the invisible force. "You need to find the others," he said, his voice desperate. "Only then will the curse be broken." Before I could respond, the figure was pulled back into the pit with an agonizing scream. The silence that followed was deafening. Antonio and I stood there, paralyzed by fear and uncertainty. We knew the fight was far from over. The well held more secrets and more trapped souls waiting for release. We needed to continue, discover who these souls were and what kept them trapped there. The curse of the Black Forest was older and more powerful than we had imagined. As we walked back to the house, the feeling of oppression still hung in the air. We knew that the real battle was just beginning, and that we would need all our courage and determination to face it. And so my story continues, marked by fear and constant vigilance. True tranquility is still out of reach, and the battle for our mental peace is constant. I hope that one day, finally, we can find true peace, away from the shadows that still surround us. The darkness may recede, but it never completely disappears, always ready to strike again. We decided that night, we would make one last effort to try to understand what was really happening. If the curse was so old and deep, we needed more information and perhaps more help. Antonio suggested that we seek help from an old friend of his, a historian who had extensively studied the legends and stories of the region. The historian, Mr. Ferreira, agreed to meet us. When we explained what we were facing, he looked at us with a seriousness that heightened my apprehension. "You are dealing with something very old and very dangerous," he said. "These souls were not simply lost. They were imprisoned by an evil power that still resides in the well." Ferreira told us about an ancient ritual, a last resort that could free all the souls at once. But the ritual required a sacrifice. Something or someone needed to become the well's new guardian, binding the curse forever. The decision was difficult, but we knew it was the only way to end the torment. That night we prepared for the ritual. The wind howled through the trees, and the shadows seemed to dance in the light of the candles we lit around the well. Ferreira began to recite the words of the ritual, his voice steady and powerful. I felt an icy cold envelope my body, and the whispers from the well intensified, turning into harrowing screams. Antonio and I were ready for anything, but nothing could prepare us for what happened next. As Ferreira recited the final words, a spectral hand emerged from the well and grabbed my arm with indescribable strength. I tried to free myself, but the hand pulled with supernatural determination. "Let me go," I shouted, but the voice that answered was cold and implacable. "You are the chosen one," said the voice. "Your sacrifice will seal the curse forever." Antonio tried to pull me back, but an invisible force threw him away. Ferreira continued reciting the ritual, but the pain and cold were unbearable. I felt like my soul was being ripped from my body. The well pulled me with a force that could not be resisted. In a last desperate effort, I looked at Antonio and Ferreira. "Finish the ritual," I shouted. "Free the souls." The light around the well intensified, and I felt my body being pulled into darkness. The last sound I heard was Ferreira's voice reciting the final words, and the screams of souls being freed. I woke up in a dark, cold place, the sound of dripping water echoing around me. I looked around and realized I was inside the well, but I wasn't alone. The souls that had been freed now surrounded me, their expressions of relief mixed with sadness. I had become the new guardian of the well, forever trapped in darkness, but knowing that I had done what was necessary to free those who were imprisoned. Antonio and Ferreira sealed the well, ensuring that the curse could never escape again. But the story of the Black Forest and the haunted well has never been forgotten. People in the village whispered about the sacrifice and the guardian of the well, a legend that became part of local folklore. And so, my story ends. Trapped in darkness, but with the certainty that souls have been freed. The terror may have receded, but the memory of the curse of the dark forest will remain forever, a reminder that some battles are fought not to be won, but to bring peace to the tormented. The Black Forest still stands dark and silent, and the well remains sealed, guarding the secrets and sacrifices of ancient times. And the voice from the well, now my own, whispers in the darkness, hoping that someone someday will hear and understand the true cost of facing the darkness